Thank you.
Got it. How do I start our camera?
Oh, you're on. You just can't tell you're on because I
I'm on.
minimized you. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Now you can see.
Oh,
us.
yeah, hi, it's me. Okay, everybody, thank you for your patience as we get everything sort of set up and transferred. Our next speaker is Jane Lutken, who's received her bachelor's in English literature from Whitman College before teaching English in France. During this time, she developed an interest in language acquisition, both first and second, which led her to pursue an MA in linguistics from Newcastle University. She received a PhD in cognitive science from Johns Hopkins in 2021 under Dr. Geraldine Legendre. She's currently working with Dr. Karen Stromswald, hi Karen, to further pursue the relationship between linguistic competence and processing mechanisms. So thank you, Jane.
Thank you. So nice. Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here and tell you a little bit about what I'm working on. I want to close it so I don't see my transcript. Great. Okay. I am interested in how children learn complex syntax. And in order to situate you just a little bit, we're not going to start with complex syntax. We're going to think a little bit about what a kid has to do to ever learn language, right? So we hear this constant speech stream and we have to learn to break that speech stream up into words and break those words up into sentences. And it's not actually a straightforward task. There's a lot going on there. And we know that language proficiency requires both knowing something about the grammar of the language that you're learning and cognitive mechanisms, right? It requires both grammar competence and processing abilities. But exactly that relationship, how that relationship balances is not quite as obvious. So the question of how much kids actually know about the grammar of the language they're learning is still a pretty relevant question and one that I'm very interested in. And we can look at that question by investigating the mistakes that kids make. We can use the errors that children make as kind of a window into their linguistic competence. So I'm going to give you kind of a really famous example. So if my pal Lewis here wants to tell us about a playing event that took place yesterday, Lewis might say something like, yesterday I played on the playground. And if Lewis says that, that's a great sentence of English, Lewis, but we don't know anything about what Lewis actually knows, because he might be great at English, or he might be a really good parrot, right? He might have heard somebody else say that and now he's saying it too. But if instead of play, Lewis uses a different verb and says, yesterday I goed to the playground, now we've actually learned something, because Lewis never heard anybody say, yesterday I goed to the playground. And so in response to the question, how much does Lewis know about English grammar? We can now say, well, he's learned about this duh sound and that it means past, but he has not yet learned what the exceptional verbs are for that rule. Okay, so we can actually learn a lot based on Lewis's little mistake. But not all the mistakes that kids make have such nice and easy, straightforward explanations. A really famous error that if you know anybody under the age of about 3 speaking English, you've probably heard this, kids will leave out the subject of their sentences, okay? And the reason this is weird is because while it is bad in English, it would be a good sentence if we were speaking Italian or Spanish or another Romance language that allowed us to drop subjects. This is a viable option in some languages, but not the one that we're learning, right? So this is something called syntactic creativity, right? So it means it looks like we're using a sentence structure that is not good in the language we're speaking, but would be good in a different language. So these are mistakes, but what causes them is still kind of a question. It could be that this type of error is the result of immature processing mechanisms. In fact, it has been argued that this exact mistake is a memory problem, but it could also be blamed on planning skills or attention. Plenty of things that we could say result in this type of error. But this could also be the result of something called parameter guided learning. So for those of you who don't spend all your time thinking about language acquisition, I'm going to tell you more about what that means. For those of you who do spend all your time thinking about language acquisition, bear with me. I'm sorry, it'll be fast. So we've got this idea that language learning is guided by both universal principles that are assumed to be innate and language-specific parameters. And this is called universal grammar. So let's look at it in an illustration kind of way. If my friend Sherry wants to express she would like some apples, universal grammar provides her with the options of how she might say this, right? An Italian-ish option and an English-ish option. And her experience with her language has to teach her which one it is. But Sherry doesn't have a ton of experience because she's a kid, right? So there are plenty of ideas about why this might happen, but Sherry might, sorry about that, might accidentally, incorrectly assume that her language is a want apples style language that doesn't require a subject. And if that happened, Sherry might produce such a sentence, not because she's actually making a mistake, but because she thinks that's right. She thinks that's how her language works. This is called an incorrect parameter setting, okay? So the idea here is that this type of error would result from Sherry mistakenly assuming that English behaves the way Italian does. And the reason this is an exciting kind of error is because syntactic creativity errors would be very good evidence for this type of language learning model, okay? So basically, such an error supports the idea that we might learn based on parameters, okay? Now, I've just gotten really excited about that type of error, right? But the best kind of syntactic creativity error as evidence for parameter guided learning would be an error that happened in both production and comprehension. And that's because we assume, doesn't have to be this way, but we assume that the grammar that underlies production is going to be the same as the grammar that underlies comprehension, okay? And if that's true, then these errors should appear in both. But there are really only two, for many reasons, documented errors that do appear in both. One is the null subject example that I just showed you. And the second is the use of medial WH phrases in biclausal questions. And because I like complex syntax, that's where we're headed, all right? Okay, so, but before we go any further, you're going to find out what that is, don't worry. What is a biclausal question is a very reasonable question that you might ask, right? Well, a biclausal question is one that has two clauses. So two sets of subject-verb pairings, okay? Like this one. What do you think a biclausal question is? Okay. So the goals that I have for my research generally and to communicate to you today include investigating errors that are made in the use of these complex questions. I want to use those errors to kind of tell me something about what kids actually know about their target grammar and learn a little bit in the process of what the relationship actually is between children's processing mechanisms and their understanding of this complex structure. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about future research ideas. So your roadmap, I'm going to, I promise, just barely hint at some cross-linguistic variation syntax work that I have done, looking at what variation there actually is in biclausal question production and comprehension use, and how these various constructions map onto different meanings. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the mistakes that kids make in production and comprehension of these questions. That's basically a previous literature discussion. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about some experiments that I have done investigating why kids make these mistakes. It could be the result of syntactic creativity, could be the result of immature processing. I'm going to tell you about an experiment I did in English and in German with these types of constructions. So before we go any further, let's talk a teeny bit about how different languages ask these types of questions, okay? So we got to do a little bit of syntax. Bear with me. It's going to be great. Okay, so in English, if we want to ask a question that's got two clauses, like who do you think she loves, we use one WH phrase here at the beginning, okay? And this WH phrase, question word, does two different jobs. In the first place, it carries the content. It tells you what type of a question you're answering, right? So this is, the answer to this is going to be something like probably an animate creature who is the object of some woman's love, okay? But this WH phrase is doing another thing as well. It's doing something called marking scope. And what that is it's telling you that this entire question is what's, this whole thing is under question. I'm not just interested in who she loves. I'm interested in who you think she loves, which is different, right? So it's doing two different things, telling me this whole thing is a question, and it's also telling me what kind of response to give. So that's what English does, but not all languages are English. Some languages are German, and they do something called WH scope marking instead. And what that looks like is this. This is the exact same question. Who do you think she loves? But instead of using one question word to do these jobs, we're going to use two different question words to do the two different jobs. One question word appears in the middle, and all it's doing is telling you what kind of a question is being asked, right? This is carrying the content. And the second weird one up here at the top is actually just telling you that the whole thing is being questioned, okay? This is not an accurate analogy, but if you think about how when you're writing in Spanish, you sometimes do that upside down question mark, okay? It's a little bit like that. It helps people, I think, digest this, all right? So there's two different question words doing these two different jobs. So it turns out there's actually quite a bit of cross-linguistic variation, okay? There are some languages that use scope marking, the two WH phrase method. There are other languages like English that only do long distance. And then there are some languages like German that actually allow you to do both. So part of my research is actually investigating, are these all the same, right? So do scope marking constructions actually mean the same thing when spoken by someone who speaks Hindi as when spoken by someone who speaks German, who's got this other alternative thing they could do? Do we use them in the same context? If I'm a speaker of German, where I could use either one, are they interchangeable, or are there certain situations I would use one and not the other? And what about this thing I'm going to call sequential questions, which is, what do you think? Who does she love? So two little questions back to back, right? Where do they fit into all of this? So that's a long way of saying, what is the meaning to form pairing? Okay, what is my desire, the desired meaning, and what is the syntactic output that communicates that meaning? All right. This is important for language acquisition because it's part of mastering the target grammar. Figuring out when you say what type of construction is important for learning. And I'm going to skip over like a ton of stuff here and just tell you that basically different language groups rather, choose different optimal outputs in different scenarios. So if I'm a speaker of Hindi, I use scope marking in this condition. If I'm a speaker of German, I use scope marking in a different condition. So why does any of that matter? Why do I care? Well, first of all, I have modeled the relationship between the meaning and form pairings, right? Using optimality theory, which I think is cool in its own right. But also this helps us understand what the kids are actually having to learn, like I said. And this also informed my stimuli design, which you will see in just a moment. Okay, so we've already gone through this part, making great progress, right? So now I want to tell you a little bit about the mistakes that children actually make in production and comprehension of these biclausal questions. So let's remember what the variation is that we're talking about. This is what they should be doing, right, in English, but there are other options for how to do this across the languages of the world, right? So how might this look as an error? Well, turns out in production, sometimes when kids want to ask, who do you think we should ask? They come up instead with, what do you think who we should ask? Okay, we got a WH phrase at the top. We got a WH phrase in the middle, right? And then let's look at a totally different construction. In response to a question like, how did the boy say what he caught? Children sometimes respond, a fish, the answer to what the boy said he caught, okay? Again, not the same syntactic construction, but it does look similar, right? It's got a WH phrase at the top, it's got a WH phrase in the middle. So maybe what kids are doing is mistakenly assuming they should have one question word at the top to mark the scope and one question word in the middle that tells them what kind of a question they should answer, okay? So is this an example of syntactic creativity? If Sherry here is going to make this mistake, maybe she actually thinks scope marking is how her language works, right? Maybe that's why she's coming up with these types of errors. Foreshadowing, I think this is a really cool idea, and I'm sorry that it's not the right answer. So some predictions that this would make. We should see the error both in production and in comprehension, right? Because remember, we think that one grammar underlies both. And I can tell you that we do. So previous literature found it in production, previous literature found it in comprehension, and little old me replicated it recently. So I found it as well. Even though we did updated methodology and all this stuff, we found both errors. But there's another prediction that this makes, which is that if a kid is doing this because they think it's the right thing, they should do it in their comprehension and production. And it turns out that doesn't happen. The kid who does it in production isn't necessarily the kid who does it in comprehension. So we didn't find any kind of a relationship between the errors in production and the errors in comprehension. So I suggested in 2020 that I thought this was the result of immature processing, but I hadn't tested that. So now that's what we're going to do. Okay. So why do kids make these mistakes? That's the question we're always coming back to. Is it the result of syntactic creativity? No, I don't think so. There hasn't been much evidence for it actually, as of right now. Now, is it the result of immature processing mechanisms is something I needed to think about a little bit more, right? So let's investigate this and let's think a little bit more about what it actually means to do processing in language, right? So these are some pretty accepted models of comprehension and production I'm about to show you. So comprehension, we think, must take place pretty incrementally, right? So you have to hear a word in order to start processing it, right? So you hear the word how, you have to recognize this as a question word. And it's kind of a special one. It needs to be associated with a verb, right? You're going along, you hear some more of the sentence, you get to a verb, You recognize it as a verb and you have to go, hey, maybe that's the one that's relevant to my question word, right? But if you've got a complex sentence and you keep going, eventually you might come to this weird what. And then you say, hey, that's a WH phrase too. It has to be associated with something farther down the line. But it can't be my main question word because I already have one of those, right? And then if you're an adult processor, then you get to the end of the sentence and you go, oh, that what is a different thing. It's a weird kind of relativizer. It's not what the question's really about. The question is about how, and then you can give the right answer. There's a lot happening here, right? Many places that things could go wrong. There's working memory involved. There's attention involved. There's inhibitory control involved. Lots of stuff that has to go right in order for you to actually understand and appropriately answer the question. Now let's talk about production. Whole different kettle of fish. The idea here is that you have to come up with a message you wish to communicate, and then you're going to simultaneously produce multiple possible syntactic constructions that could communicate your message. Pick one, double check that it does what you want it to do, and then start saying it, okay? So again, there's a lot going on there. You're simultaneously coming up with these different ways of asking your question, right? You have to pick one and you have to inhibit the others now, right? So there's attention, there's planning, again, inhibitory control, lots of stuff happening. So I've just told you there's a lot going on. And now I'm going to tell you why I'm going to look at working memory in particular. And I'm going to convince you the same way I had to convince myself that it was a good idea, okay? So basically what we're going to do is we're going to measure working memory and use it as a kind of general indicator of processing ability, okay? And here's why. First of all, Baddeley's model of executive control postulates that working memory acts as a kind of buffer for between processing and action. So if you've got terrible working memory, kind of doesn't matter if you're great at everything else because you're going to mess up on the way to doing your action anyhow. Okay, so that's one reason. Another reason is other people have done it. Yay. Also, previous work has actually directly linked working memory to both production and comprehension. All right. And finally, and this is a non-negligible reason, it's an easy thing to take a measure for in kids. All right. So that's what we're going to do. So in order to test kind of whether these errors are the result of immature processing, the predictions that we have are that we should see a relationship between working memory and these two language tasks. It may not be super strong because it's like an indicator, but there should be a relationship. We should also see similar errors being made by children of similar processing abilities, regardless of their target grammar, right? And that's because if my processing is limited because I'm immature, because I'm 5, it shouldn't matter if I'm learning English or learning something else. So to test these things, I'm going to do an experiment looking at kids' production, comprehension, and working memory in English. And then I'm going to do the same thing in Germany. All right. So let's start talking about the English kids, right? Or the English experiment. So we had 50 kids come into the lab. We had to exclude 18 for various reasons, including they couldn't do it. They threw up halfway through, plenty of things like this. We ended up analyzing data from 32. I do want to point out that 12 of them were in person and 20 were on the computer. I'm happy to talk about how I did that and what it did afterwards. And what we're going to do is a within subjects design. So everybody's doing everything. We do a working memory task measured via forward and backward digit span, which I'll talk about in a second. A production task that does not include a lead in. Now, what's that? The thing here is I thought it might be the case that all the previous literature, including my own, had elicited these questions in the following way. They told kids, the question starts, who do you think? Or the question starts, who do you believe, right? And I thought that might be what was making kids make the mistake. So I came up with a way to elicit the question without telling them how to start it. And then we did a comprehension task. So, and for working memory, we did both forward and backward digit span for a couple reasons. First, forward digit span has been associated with comprehension and backward digit span with production. A composite score has been argued to be like the best way to get a good picture of processing ability. I used a standardized task from differential ability scales 2. And it's basically you're just asking the kids to repeat what you said, either forward or backward. And you start with 2 digits and you work up until they can't do it anymore. And based on how many they get right and how many mistakes they make, you give them an ability score, okay? So that's what we did for working memory. Now for production, what I did was make this novel kind of story. It's a continuous problem solving thing, kind of like a choose your own adventure, right, novel. And what you have to do is figure out what everyone thinks we should do in each situation. We elicited therefore 4 practice questions, 3 fillers to kind of break the pattern up, and 12 target questions that were controlled for whether they were who or whether they were subject or object questions. And the innovation is, again, that we got rid of this lead, and the way we did it was by making it a translation task. So we have one character that doesn't speak English and another character who does. And this has been done with English as a second language learners previously as well. And so basically what this means is it's now felicitous to say, who does he think we should talk to, right? Even if he's right here, right? So that's how it makes it, you're going to see an example, but that's how it makes it kind of a reasonable thing to do. So now it's story time, okay? These are my tasks, so get ready. This is like my favorite thing. These are my buddies, Mork and Mindy, right? Mindy is a space exploring raccoon, and she's gone all over the universe and made friends with Mork, all right? And now she's bringing him back to Earth to show him her planet. But on the way, their spaceship crashes and the pieces of it go everywhere. And now what we have to do is find all the pieces and put the spaceship back together, all right? But at every turn of the road, basically, we're going to find out what all 3 people in this story want to do. And because we're in a true democracy, we're always going to break ties and do whatever 2 out of the 3 want. So for example, what happens here is we've just found the engine, but the engine is broken. So then what I say to the kid is, who can fix the engine? Do you have an idea? There's Jen the mechanic who can fix anything, and Bob the farmer who fixed a fence earlier. Who can fix the engine? Kids generally catch on to my hints and tell me that it's going to be Jen the mechanic. And then we say, okay, let's find out about Mindy. Can you ask Mindy who can fix the engine? Kids ask who can fix the engine. Mindy always disagrees with the kid, creating a dichotomy. So now we got to find out about Mork, who doesn't speak English. So now we say, okay, let's find out about Mork. Mindy, can you ask about Mork? Or something like that. And then the kids will say whatever they end up saying, right? And then Mork agrees with the kid, and we go off to ask Jen the mechanic to fix the engine. So just so you can see a kid actually doing it.
And we have Farmer Bob, who helped fix the fence. Who can fix the engine, Gabriel? You have an idea? Yeah, I think you're right. I think Jen the mechanic can fix the engine. Let's find out about Mindy. Can you ask her who can fix the engine?
Mindy, who can fix the engine?
I think Farmer Bob can fix the engine. Okay, let's find out about Mork. Can you ask Mindy?
Mindy, what does Mork think? Who can fix the car? Who can fix the engine?
Good question. I'll ask anything.
All right. So in case you couldn't hear, he says, Mindy, what does Mork think? Who can fix the engine? Right? Okay. So we got the thing. We got 2 WH phrases, right? But we can also definitely see some wheels turning, right? So generally what happened is the task was overall successful, by which I mean only 31 out of about 380 utterances were not an effort at a biclausal question, okay? A third of the time, actually, kids came up totally with the perfectly good sentence. Who does Mork think can fix the engine, all right? But the most common mistake was this inclusion of this medial WH phrase. And we did have a lot of workarounds, okay? By workaround, I mean totally good sentence of English that was not long distance. Like infinitival clauses, like who does Mork want to help us? Totally pragmatically appropriate, good sentence of English. Think about constructions, like what does Mork think about who can fix the engine? And one I really liked, quotatives. So can you ask Mork who can fix the engine? Right? Very clever. I didn't tell them they couldn't do that. So generally, I think this is a successful task. People have given me a hard time about the fact that we come up with not the long distance one sometimes, but I think that just indicates that kids are actually pretty flexible in what they can do. I think it does show that they know some of the options that they've got. Let's look at the comprehension task. We had 6 targets and 2 fillers to make sure kids could actually do it. And the questions all have this how, blah, 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 what, blah, blah, blah pattern. Okay. So like, how did Steve tell Sherry what he was going to steal? You're going to see an example, so don't panic if you don't know what that means, but all the stories are balanced for prominence. So the telling event was as exciting as the stealing event. And they're also balanced for past and future tense. So that wasn't always like the telling event that happened most recently. Okay. I think we're doing story time again now. Yeah. Okay. So this is the story of evil Steve and Detective Sherry. So Detective Sherry here has solved all these crimes, and she knows that evil Steve is behind all of them. All right. And so she thinks also that today he's going to steal the Queen's crown, which is on display at the museum. If we go over to Steve's place, we see he is in fact thinking about stealing the Queen's crown today, but he knows that Sherry is onto him, and he decides he better trick her, better distract her. So he decides he's going to tell Sherry that he's going to steal the ring. Okay. And that'll distract her from the crown. but he needs to tell Sherry without getting caught. So he's going to use his special TV machine to put him on Sherry's television and tell her that he's going to steal the ring. But his TV machine breaks. So Steve has to go old school and write Sherry a letter. Okay, so pretty soon Sherry gets this letter, and on it she reads, "Foolish Detective Sherry, I'm going to steal the Queen's diamond ring and you can't stop me. Ha ha ha, evil Steve." So Sherry runs to protect the ring, but when she gets to the palace, she finds it is perfectly safe on the Queen's, royal dresser here. So she figures out she's been tricked. She runs to the museum and catches Steve red-handed. So justice prevails. That's the end of the story. And then children would hear a pre-recorded question posed by this friendly Hillary Hippo character. And Hillary's going to ask, how did evil Steve tell Detective Sherry what he was going to steal? What's the answer, adult speakers of English? The letter. Good job. Very good. Sometimes that makes me nervous. So the general answers, this is open-ended, so kids could say anything. But generally, they're going to say something like the letter, right? So they'll get it right. They might answer a how question, but not really remember the story very well and say the TV machine, right? The one to watch for is the ring, because if they answer the ring, that means they've interpreted this question to mean, what did Steve tell Sherry he was going to steal? Okay. And then finally, they might just kind of ignore the beginning of the question and answer what he was going to steal. They might say the crown. Okay. So those are just possible answers. And I can feel people saying, gosh, that story was complicated. There's no way kids could do that. Let's watch this kid.
Okay, here's my question. How did evil Steve tell Detective Sherry what he was gonna steal?
By writing her a message.
Awesome.
Good
Very
job.
good.
All right. So by writing her a message, in case anybody didn't know. All right. So generally, here's what happened. A little over half the time, kids came up with the right answer. Okay. But the most common error was the ring, was the scope marking like error. The TV machine made an appearance, and so did the crown, but they weren't super prominent. Kids didn't normally come up with that. One thing they said that was really cool was it was a trick. He lied. And to be fair, this is also what my mom said when I told her that exact story. She said he never told her what he was going to steal, which is true. So that I take as a kind of also adult-like response. And then we got 10% of the time we got like other things like the castle, the stuff that didn't have an obvious interpretation. This is essentially the same thing we found in 2020, which is always good. Results. Generally, what we found in the working memory was that everybody was able to do both the forward and backward digit span tasks. We did have above average performance overall. So we had kind of a smart group of kids, right? So kids who were already good at this kind of thing, but we did see a pretty wide range. Reminder of the predictions. If these errors are evidence of syntactic creativity, we expect some kind of a relationship between production and comprehension, because again, we assume the same grammar underlies both. If these errors are caused by immature processing mechanisms, we expect some kind of relationship between each language task and their working memory. Different processes don't necessarily need to underlie the error for production and comprehension. Doesn't need to be the same one, right? So we don't necessarily expect these language tasks to be related or to have people do as well on one as the other. So now I'm going to show you some like fake data to know what to expect. So we might expect either a totally linear relationship. This depends on the type of model of language learning that you're assuming. So you might expect some kind of a linear thing going on, or you might expect a totally just a mess, but with a few kids who are like devoted to this, right? A few kids who are always going to do this error in production and comprehension. And what we actually find is neither one of these things, okay? So we do find the error in both. So what you're looking at here is target-like, oh, I did it wrong. I skipped one, sorry. What you're looking at here is the scope marking comprehension error on the x-axis and the production on the y-axis. So you do see kids who made both errors, right? So this kid 75% of the time is coming up with a WH phrase in his production, but he never made the mistake in comprehension, okay? So we do see kind of exceptional kids, but the kid who makes the error in production is not necessarily the kid who makes it in comprehension. But now let's look at the relationship between working memory and these productions. So nobody's writing home about these R values, okay, at all. But what you're looking at here is target-like production on the x-axis, working memory ability score on the y-axis, and you can see that there's definitely like a kind of a pattern going on. If you have better working memory, then you're more likely to get the answer right? Lower working memory and you're less likely to get the answer right. So that's for target like, that's doing it like an adult. But remember, I'm interested in errors and in one in particular. So the opposite is true for the errors, right? How likely are you to come up with a medial WH production is on the x-axis, and your composite working memory score is on the y-axis. Again, kind of, if you have good working memory, you're not really coming up with this mistake. If you have low working memory, you kind of are, okay? Now let's turn to comprehension. Now we're looking at adult-like comprehension. So how likely are you to get the right answer is on the x-axis, and your working memory is on the y-axis again. So it's the same kind of pattern, right? We're like pretty good at it. If you have pretty good working memory, you're like pretty likely to get the answer right. Now here's something a little bit weird. Those were all composite working memory scores, so forward plus backward digit span. That didn't work for the WSM-like error, okay? So now again, you're looking at the error. This is the ring responses on the x-axis. But what did work is when you looked at just the forward digit span alone, okay? Which was pretty interesting. And actually what previous work had said was that forward digit span was related to comprehension. So again, got good working memory, less likely to make this mistake. So to summarize, we replicated the lack of correlation between production and comprehension. We totally replicated the comprehension findings. We replicated the production findings, even though we had changed the task, right? We got rid of the lead in, but we still found the error, which means it wasn't like the task that was making kids make the mistake. And we saw many more workarounds. We also found that working memory like kind of predicts adult-like performance in production and in comprehension. The composite digit span predicts medial WH production. Forward digit span predicts WSM-like comprehension. So that's kind of interesting. So back to our question of why do kids make these mistakes? Still not feeling like it's syntactic creativity. Now I feel like it even less. Is it the result of immature processing? Well, we found that working memory kind of predicts performance on these language tasks, but what does that like mean, right? So again, nobody's writing home about these R values. So what this meant to me was we need to further investigate what's actually going on with this processing. So we need a better, more defined model of what we think is actually going on when they're making this mistake. So let me take you back to the model of comprehension that I showed you, right? If we're listening to a sentence like, how did Steve tell Sherry what he was going to steal? We've got these two WH phrases, all right? I think what's happening is that kids with better working memory are better able to maintain the first WH phrase as the one that they need to respond to, and they're better able to inhibit this other thing from interfering and changing their interpretation of the question. This is my idea that must be tested someday. All right. In production, it's a little bit more complicated. And some of you, I've even seen it in your eyes, have said, Jane, why don't you just think kids are asking two questions in a row, right? Why do you think this is one big question and not, what does Mark think? Who should we ask? Which is a totally viable thing to ask in English, right? Well, syntacticians are going to come back and say, well, they could be doing that, but then maybe they're just actually asking a scope marking question, but they've made a mistake with their subject auxiliary inversion in the embedded clause, and you can't really tell me that these are definitely two questions in a row. Okay, but even if you think that argument doesn't make any sense, I can tell you that of the productions that included two WH phrases, only 43% of them could be two questions in a row. Because some of them were things like, what does Mork think who we should ask? That's definitely not two questions in a row, right? So something else is also going on. And here's what I think it is. Let's go back. Well, there's two different things. First, I think some kids are asking two questions in a row. And second, I think what we're looking at some of the time is something called a syntactic blend, right? Which is something that we've seen in kids and we've seen in adults. And now that you know what it is, you might even notice yourself do it. Remember this model I showed you? What a syntactic blend is what results when you come up with your idea, right? And then you simultaneously produce these two possible ways of communicating it, but you don't successfully pick one. You maybe start one and finish the other, or you don't like successfully pull them apart. So maybe what's going on some of the time, at least, is that kids are kind of starting this thing and finishing this thing, right? Or mixing them up in other ways. And again, we know kids do this with other constructions, and we know adults do this. And furthermore, we know that adults do it more when they're under some kind of cognitive load. So that's what I think is happening with some of these errors. So to summarize what we found out from English, we haven't seen any evidence from that it's syntactic creativity. We've seen that working memory like kind of predicts adult-like behavior as well as these mistakes. I have suggested two ideas that I need to test in the future. One is that errors in comprehension are the result of kids failing to maintain that WH phrase. And I've suggested that the errors in production are either sequential questions or syntactic blends. So we're actually going to see further support for these ideas when we look at the data from Germany. So now I'm going to go to Germany, all right? So there are a couple different reasons to do this task with German speakers. First of all, it's going to add to our understanding of German acquisition, which is actually kind of surprisingly understudied for a language like German. We're going to see if German-speaking kids make any syntactic creativity errors. Maybe they're going to come up with long distance questions or something, right? Maybe they'll make similar errors in production and comprehension to the English-speaking kids, which would support the idea that they're the result of processing limitations, right? Reminder, one of our predictions earlier on was that children that have similar processing abilities should kind of have similar error rates, right? So, and then this is just happy circumstance. We're going to use German-speaking children's aptitude for verb placement to explain some of the examples, or to tell us how many examples of sequential questions we should expect. Here's what I'm talking about there. In German, in matrix clauses, so in the main clause, your verb has to appear in second position, all right? But in an embedded clause, the verb has to appear at the end. So then even if you're someone like me who actually doesn't speak very good German, you can look at these complex sentences, and if you know what your verb is, you can tell if it's an embedded thing or if it's a matrix thing. And it turns out German-speaking kids are really good at verb placement really early. Even actually kids who are under age 3 are like really good at this. So the argument that the syntacticians gave me about English speakers, like you can't really tell if it's sequential questions, you can tell for German-speaking kids because they're really good at it. So just to show you again the difference, so this one on top is the scope marking sentence, and these are sequential questions on the bottom, all the same words, right? I'm going to circle all your verbs, and you can tell in this first one, the verb appears in second position, right here, and in the embedded clause at the end. But in sequential questions, 2 little questions in a row, the verb's in second position in both cases, okay? So all you really have to do is look at where the verb is to tell whether kids are coming up with the embedded question or 2 monocausal questions in a row. So we got 38 German-speaking adults to do this. They're not really controls. They're actually like to test if my experiment works. Then we had 48 German-speaking kids, ended up excluding 20 of them, of roughly the same age as the English-speaking kids. This is 28 kids, 4 fewer than I had in English. Just pointing it out, being up front, we had to stop because of the whole pandemic. So all the materials are exactly the same as what we used for the English-speaking kids. We did a working memory task, we did our production task. With comprehension, we did 2 things. We gave them the same exact stories, but the questions changed. So in one condition, they got exactly what the English-speaking kids got. How did Steve tell Sherry what? In one condition. And in the other condition, they got the true scope marking question. So what did Steve tell Sherry that he was going to steal, basically, okay? Because we had to find out if they could even do that, right? I went to the University of Constance and we ran it in German, of course, with German speakers. It was all transcribed and translated by a professional translator. I did the coding, but my coding was checked by my native speakers. Just a reminder of what we're actually looking for. The adult-like production, right, is now what does Mork think who we should ask, right? That's what the grown-ups are saying. An example of syntactic creativity might be this long distance question, so it looks like English, right? In comprehension, in response to this question, that's the scope marking question, the adult answer is now the ring, okay? In response to this question, like we showed the English speaking kids, the adult answer is the letter, okay? Whoops, sorry, I need to go past that. Everybody with me here, that's important, okay. So let's talk about some results in working memory. Again, the performance was kind of above average, but within the range that was reported. I will point out that the working memory scores were way narrower, like there was less of a range for the German speaking kids. No idea why that would be. And comprehension, in response to the scope marking questions, like what did Steve tell Sherry what he was going to steal, kids gave the right answer over 80% of the time, which actually is the same thing that happened with English speaking kids when I asked them this question, right? So we're doing really, really well. But in response to the question, how did Steve tell Sherry what he was going to steal? They were getting the right answer about half the time. The most common mistake was the scope marking like response. And then the TV machine made an appearance and so did the crown. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it's exactly what the English speaking kids did. So here you're looking at like group averages, English speaking kids on the left, German speaking kids on the right. I promise it really is 2 different data sets. And as you can see, they both kind of have the same pattern going on. about half the time they get it right. The most common mistake, scope marking responses. And if you're curious what this looks like, instead of group averages, if we look at like individual averages, this is the same thing, okay? Except, well, it looks green on this screen, but like green or blue, depending on what you're looking at, is German-speaking kids, and the red or pink is English-speaking kids. This is the correct response, and then the WSM-like response is down here on the end. So you can see we've actually got very similar distributions going on as well, okay? All right. Unlike English speakers, there's no significant relationship between working memory and any particular error type, which is a little bit weird, but I'm blaming it on the narrow range of working memory scores. Like English speakers, working memory did predict adult-like performance. Again, age was not a predictor. I forgot to mention that. Age is not a predictor of performance. Working memory is a better predictor than age. In production, about half the time they were coming up with scope marking constructions. About 11% of the time they came up with 2 monocausal questions in a row. Never came up with long distance, so not looking like syntactic creativity. And we did see many workarounds, just like we did with English. Can you ask Mork who we should ask or whatever? Infinitival clauses and monocausal questions all made an appearance. Oh, it should be pointed out that adults only came up with scope marking about 80% of the time. The rest of the time they were doing sequential questions, okay? So, yeah. So again, what we're looking at is English speakers on the left, German speakers on the right. There are significantly more correct productions produced by German speakers than English speakers. Put a pin in that, we can talk about it later. But crucially, there's not a significant difference in the proportion of workarounds for each group. And most importantly, there's not a significant difference between the number of times German-speaking kids came up with 2 questions in a row and the number of times English-speaking kids produced a thing that had a WH phrase in the middle, which leads me to believe that it is reasonable to think that at least some of the things that English-speaking kids were doing was coming up with 2 monocausal questions. So we found no relationship between working memory and any particular production type, again, likely because of the lack of variation, but that was also because they were coming up with adult-like productions like most of the time, right? So we decided to look at another type of error, which is fluencies. By this, we mean things like audible restarts, stutters, repetition of the same word, a mistake on the actual WH phrase, or swapping the WH phrase. And when we looked at that, actually, first I'm going to show you an example. I know y'all don't necessarily speak German, but I think it's still worthwhile to hear her.
Kannst du fragen, was Exempel verzeichnen kann?
Okay. So what she actually did, I don't know how well you can see this, is she says, Mindy, can you ask Mork what he thinks where? And then she swaps where for who can help us. Okay. So this we're considering a disfluency because she starts over with a different WH phrase. That counts as a disfluency. Okay. So when we looked at the relationship between working memory and disfluencies, we did see a relationship, right? So we've got composite working memory score on the y-axis and disfluencies on the x-axis. Better working memory, fewer disfluencies, right? So to summarize the findings from Germany, German kids show adult-like production and comprehension of scope marking. They are good at it. Not any evidence of using any kind of alternative construction. Adult-like comprehension is significantly related to working memory. Disfluencies at the clausal boundary are significantly related to working memory. And we saw striking similarities to the English-speaking kids in production, right? When they were doing this, like responses to how did Steve tell Sherry what? And then finally, the number of sequential questions produced is comparable to the number of medial WH productions by English-speaking kids, which supports the idea that at least some of these are sequential questions produced by English speakers. So just to wrap up, English-speaking kids do make these errors in production and comprehension of bicausal questions, but their errors aren't related to each other. The relationship between working memory and adult-like behavior, as well as working memory and the 2 error types in English, has been established. We also found a relationship between working memory and adult-like behavior in comprehension in German. We saw a relationship between working memory and disfluencies in production in German as well. And the claims that I am making are that comprehension errors result from failure to maintain that true WH phrase, which I think happens for both English and German-speaking kids. Both English and German-speaking kids produce sequential questions as a workaround sometimes. German-speaking kids production errors appear to us as disfluencies, and I think English-speaking kids are probably making at least a few blends, so that's something I'm going to look into later. So overall, we haven't seen evidence that these errors are the result of syntactic creativity. Rather, it looks like kids in both countries, right, speaking both languages, know a lot about the grammar they're trying to learn, and their immature processing mechanisms result in errors some of the time, regardless of what language you're learning. And if that's true, if all these mistakes are the result of processing, then it makes a straightforward prediction that adults whose processing mechanisms are limited should also make this mistake. So what Karen Strumswald and I are working on right now, actually running as of yesterday, yay, are giving adults a working memory task to do while they are doing our comprehension task. Future directions include working memory task while they're doing the production task, and also more work with kids looking at different constructions and testing different types of processing abilities. And the list goes on and on. Thanks a lot. You have so many questions.
Right.
Wonderful. Come on up. Should I stop? I guess I'll stop screen sharing.
I love that you did English and German because that's so perfect.
Oh, why is it so perfect?
Well, because German does that exact thing. Have
Yeah.
that scope marking thing.
It was on purpose.
It's yeah, it's so beautiful. I don't know. I'm really struck by the way that the kids produce that scope marking WH and then the contentful WH down at the bottom. And,
Yeah.
and I can't help thinking about like the syntaxy explanation for why you would do that, right?
Yes. Tell us what it is, Ryan.
Which is that you have this like WH feature that you have to put up there for the scope marking reasons.
Yeah.
And then thinking about it in terms of like production and like an order of operations, if you're building a structure, you think like, I know that I need WH scope marking and I'm just going to put this feature here. And then if they start producing like the to spell out or whatever, before they've finished building the whole thing,
Yeah.
you don't actually know what WH
Well,
thing
what it
goes
is.
there.
Well,
So-
should it be what? Should it be who? We
so
don't know.
one question I have is, in terms of the errors that you observe with what kids produce, do they ever produce anything other than what in that position?
Great question. Fabulous question. The answer to that is yes. So
Oh,
some of
what?
yeah, but it's still reasonable.
Okay.
Sometimes they do who, right? Who does Steve or who does Mork think who we should ask,
Okay,
which would just be a copy,
Right,
right? So
right,
that
right.
feels more like I moved my who and I
That's-
moved it again and I didn't get rid of it,
that
right?
is, they plan the whole thing, but
Mhm.
then pronounce both.
But
the-
then they just failed to
So-
stop themselves from saying the second one, right? So that's a great explanation. And then the other one, the other thing that you bring up is a really cool thing. So the idea there, folks, is basically that you move like the questionness of the WH phrase to the top, and maybe you end up pronouncing it as what, right? Okay, so the reason that I could be convinced either one of these things is right, is the short answer. The reason I don't think it's necessarily just failure to delete the copy is because they come up with both who do you think who
Mhm.
and what do you think who,
Mhm.
okay? So do you actually know a lot about scope marking? Because what you said was
Little bit.
pretty scope marking-ish. Okay, so like, it's also possible that scope marking is really just the movement of like a piece of the WH phrase, a particle, right?
Mhm.
And that is being voiced as what? I kind of love that idea. And I don't know if I could definitely tell you it's wrong, except that there's like a mixture of what goes on. And part of me wants to do like a really intense study of like an individual and be like, does this kid always come up with what, blah, 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 who? Or does this kid always come up with who, blah, 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 what,
Mhm.
right? Or who, whichever way it was gonna go. But yeah, totally plausible. Do you have follow-ups?
Yeah, I'm wondering if, so part of, like talking about this makes me wonder if there's more than one explanation for why they might produce specific things in that scope marking position. And one could be that they've just acquired the wrong spell out algorithm, like the
Yeah.
wrong linearization algorithm.
Uh-huh.
Because in English, you have a linearization algorithm that says, don't pronounce this first one, only pronounce the second one.
Yeah.
You could also get one that says pronounce like the copy
Uh-huh.
with all of the features. But you could also have one that says, just pronounce that scope marking feature, but nothing else.
Yeah, but that would be extra weird because then
That'd
you
be
wouldn't know about the content of the question. It would be like, what does Steve think we should ask or something, right?
Well, you can still
Or
have
maybe-
the one at the bottom, right? What does Steve
Ooh.
think, who we should ask?
I just thought of another reason that it can't just be spell out, right?
Uh-huh.
Is we never get, what does, hold on, wait a minute. What does Mork think who we can help who? We never get
Oh.
you never get that. You only get it in the middle and
Uh-huh.
the top.
Right.
So it can't purely be, I don't know what spell out should look like.
Yeah, it can't be
Right.
complete absence of.
Yeah.
But that makes sense.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
cool.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was also thinking, if you're familiar with the production stuff by showed a moment. It's also about speech planning and like how people don't plan certain things very far ahead. I haven't spent enough time thinking about this because it was just like while the talk was going on, but I'm wondering if these things somehow connect with each other.
Yeah, I actually talked to him about this at the, what was it, the LSA? No, the Human Sentence Processing Conference.
CUNY?
Yeah, the conference formerly known as CUNY. Yes. And so we talked a little bit about it, and basically, so he does it more with, or at least the poster I was at was about adult work, and talking about how the like amount of pause before you get going is like a really great indicator of how well you end up producing the sentence. So we do know that kids actually, so this is a McDaniel paper as well, kids don't tend to like do all their planning, right? So basically what happens is with adults, if you give them this complicated thing to ask, then they like sit and think for a second, and then they say the whole sentence. Kids will go, what do you think, who we, they like plan and as they're going kind of, right? So I have talked to him a little bit about it, and we'll see.
This is actually what got me thinking about it, because you have like the video example of the kid at the very beginning says something like that. It's like, what do you think? And then like, who we should ask? And I was like, oh, that's so great, because it looks like you're only planning one half at a time.
Exactly.
And you don't have all the information.
Yeah. Well, the other fun thing, and then we should probably let other people ask questions, but the other fun thing is that the kids are doing this kind of planning thing at the clausal boundary, not so much like everywhere. Just realized that my hand motions are like really dramatic on Zoom. Sorry. But yeah, so they're like getting to this clausal boundary thing. Then they're kind of realizing, whoops, I don't know what to do. I passed my point of what I've actually planned. I better pause and do something weird and then continue. Which is cool.
The only one other thing is, do you have slides on the OT syntax stuff? Like, did you do an OT syntax analysis?
I did do an OT syntax analysis. Let's do it later.
I see Karen's raised her hand.
Hi, Karen.
Hey, so a couple of questions. The first one sort of bounces off of Ryan's question. Have you or anyone else looked at the yes, no? So do you know who she, did Sally know who she liked or something like that? Where the kids answer not the yes, no question, but the who Sally liked.
I have not done it.
Yeah, because if it's that they're sort of pulling some part of the question, like you would expect, to get the do and to make it a yes, no question, you might expect in the same way that they would make the comprehension error of answering the local question.
That's a very straightforward prediction. Yes, I am unaware of anybody doing it that way. So like, do you know who she likes? And answering, she likes Sally.
Right. Because it seems like that would be pretty straightforward. The other thing is, a lot of your questions require a whole lot of theory of mind, right? So I got to know and think about what he thinks about what she thinks about. So have you considered doing some kind of a theory of mind, sort of like the embedded theory of mind task? So maybe sometimes when they answer the local questions, like, I don't know who thought what, but I know, like, I'm going to answer the local question because that.
So the first answer to the question is, have I thought about doing it with a theory of mind task? Yes, I have. Do I want to? Absolutely. Let's do it. But I don't think that's 100% of the explanation, because that would predict you'd get a lot of so what he was going to steal answers, right? So that's the crown. You would have gotten a whole ton of the crown responses, which we actually didn't, right? So you get a lot of, well, it's not even a lot. None of it's even a lot, but like 20% of the time, kids come up with the ring answer, right? Which is actually still kind of a more complicated theory of mind thing, because that's the answer to what he said he was going to steal, not in fact what he was going to steal. So I do think it's, so 100% it's related. There's a lot of theory of mind going on in these stories, because they all have to be about liars. Like every one of them is about a liar, because we have to be able to say there's a different thing that what he was going to steal, and another thing that is what he said he was going to steal. So there's a ton of that happening. Yes.
So I know you didn't find a relationship with age, but I was thinking maybe for some of these types of errors, it would be the younger children, specifically with these like sort of theory of mind-ish type cases. So if you looked at the different types of errors, you might different types of errors specifically. I mean, I don't know if Alan's in the room, but it seems that your kids, at least your youngest kids, some of these questions would be just conceptually very difficult.
Yeah, that's a good point. I haven't looked at whether like the Crown responses were all made by people under a certain age or something like that. I haven't, or even looked at the relationship between that and age. That's a really good question. Anybody else?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Try to keep it short since we're well over
Sorry.
time. So I was thinking about the use of digit span as a measurement of working memory. Obviously, it's a classic one.
Mhm.
But my intuition on your task, because I thought about it over the last year, is that it feels like it's more about, can you separate two separate streams and hold them both in memory at once? Can you have your grammatical structure and your content kind of in parallel, one organizing the other?
Mhm.
So my intuition would be, it's not about, can you hold a single stream of numbers in sequencing your in memory, but can you have two parallel numbers and letters or something like that?
Ooh.
Ooh.
How cruel, these poor
I don't know if
Yeah.
4-year-olds can do that, but I thought I would ask.
Maybe. That's a great idea. That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think it would be real hard to get them to do that. Partly I'm telling you that because it's real hard to get them to do backwards digit span. Okay, because cute story, I promise it won't be long, but I spent all this time figuring out how to explain what I wanted them to do, right? Because backwards actually isn't an obvious idea, right? So like I would do this thing where I'd say, okay, so what I say, you say backwards. So if I say chair, table, you say table, chair. Get it? All this stuff. All right. And so the kids are going, yeah, we get it. And then, so there's one child, I said, okay, are you ready? 5, 7. And he goes like this. 5, 7. Spun around and did it backwards, which I deserve an Emmy for not cracking up laughing, but I said, I explained that poorly. Let's try again, right? So I think you're right that type of a thing might tap into what's going on a little bit better. I would have to think really hard about how to get kids to do it at the same time, but maybe it could be done. Maybe.
Try it on my 4-year-old.
Do it, yes. I was gonna say, you've got kids that are appropriate age.
Like even the thing about having two sources, right? It's just not a one-on-one relationship between like how working memory resources get deployed for stuff like syntactic search. You make it some like dedicated syntactic working memory.
Yeah,
So
I mean, to be honest though, I don't think the same kind of working memory that is required for you to go 7, 9, 6, 2 is what we're doing with syntax, right?
exactly. It's definitely the gross measure.
Yeah.
So I don't know the game version that's gonna help.
Yeah.
Jane, can you repeat the questions, please?
Oh, sure. So what Ryan just pointed out, that he doesn't think that John's idea about doing like memorizing numbers and memorizing letters would necessarily reflect what's really going on with the two different streams. Is that accurate? Okay.
And with that, I think we should call it off. Thank you.
Thank
Appreciate it.
you.
Good job.
Thanks, everybody.